these were people who'd been doing that for generations and, were there, didn't trust institutions, didn't trust the colonial governments behind them, didn't trust county government. You got to protect yourself. Nothing good will come of government, right? It's going to be, you got to maximize your personal freedom and autonomy and defend it, or the powerful will take it from you, whether it's those meddling Yankees or the aristocrats down in Charleston and Williamsburg. And so that was a separate culture. And again, those are all motives that, sure, they cared about making money and their prosperity, but those drives are not economic drives. They're like, certain culture and value sets, and sometimes they get tied and rolled into religion and stuff, transcend just the material motives. Oh, material motives, absolutely. Especially once you start consolidating interest blocks around profiting on things, then it really takes off. But
yeah, I that's a really good answer you gave right there. I think sometimes also I'm looking at it from the perspective of like the top 5% versus the 95% of these groups that come in, right? So the top 5% that seize power, maybe have access to that money or whatever, they can have the luxury in some cases of having less concern about how they get the money, whereas the 95% may be the types that are going to rise up and be like, wait a minute, not on our watch, fuck the Yankees,
right.
that kind of thing.
And some of these societies, like as you might imagine in the description of the Deep South Barbadian culture, right? That's a entire society organized around serving the interest of the few people on top, right? The ruling plantation families, it's an oligarchy, and society and the laws and taxation, everything are designed to protect this tiny group of people, not for the interests of the people.
That's right.
Even setting aside the slavery, not even the interests of anyone who's not the oligarchy on top of it. Whereas you go to Yankeedom, and incredibly intolerant in many ways, but the people who came and settled in that early Puritan fleet, they were surprisingly educated. They were, family units, kind of middle-class people moving as groups, setting up their own towns and replicating institutions from the beginning. It's like a sort of bourgeois, right? If you have those two different starting points, right, sort of oligarchic feudalism and a covenanted people with a middle-class ethos, those are two very different spots to start from in terms of power balances and how the economy is going to evolve and be formed. One is definitely extractive, and the other one has, potential to be moving in other directions to make your money. They end up filling, the participation of the New Englanders in slavery is through dominating the shipping and becoming the merchants who are moving things around. So there's, they're all implicated in it, but it's, I guess a higher, not the extraction model. They're providing the higher services and logistics and banking and everything else to make it all work.
Yeah, and we've talked about on multiple occasions today the slave trade and how that worked and the shipping routes and how it even intersected with piracy. But it is really, I say, hindsight bias, obviously. We have the luxury of that now to be able to see like this is so horrible. But the fact that economically people would just make that Greco-Roman assumption like, okay, well, these people are less than, so we'll just chain them up and bring them here. That's just something I can never process through my head.
The idea of human equality was not there for sure.
Oh, yeah.
All of these societies had all of these assumptions about, the indigenous people, and some of them considered the other, whether it's racial or religious or whatever, there can be gradations, but very unequal and hierarchical assumptions. That's kind of what makes the arguments put forth in the Declaration of Independence and all that are kind of revolutionary, because it's this sort of stated commitment, even if they didn't actually do it, to the idea that humans are somehow created equal with morally equal dibs on the right to, survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue your happiness as you understand it and access the government. In 1770s, whoa, hold on there, right?
You're right.
We didn't do it, but just the fact that was put out there was, bucking centuries of history and Europe and elsewhere. Advanced civilizations, humans have been doing this for 5,000 years, and it's a whole story of subjugation and autocracy.
Yeah.
Individual freedom wasn't part of the conversation until about 400 years ago. Like 3,600 years of not that in the conversation.
Oh yeah.
Medieval period, it wasn't that individuals had any dib. It was like society is a giant superorganism, and the one hand is the tax collectors, and the other hand is the soldiers, and the feet are the peasants, and the head is the aristocracy running the show, and the heart is the priestly class, right? And that we're all part of one organism. You each have your place, and you would never leave your place because it's been ordained that that's where you are. And that's kind of the default assumptions that we've had to move forward from. So,
And again, it's an American centric thought, and I think it's a good one, by the way, to believe that like you can work your way towards the American dream or something, because everywhere else in the world, even to this day, it's like you're born into something. No, you stay there.
Yeah, your station is fixed.
That's right. You're 1 day old, and you're never going to be more than a coal miner or something like that.
Right.
In America, technically, that's not how it is. It's not to say those patterns don't still form on a larger percentage basis, but there's the opportunity from someone to go from 0 to 100 in this country to this day, which is pretty cool.
Right. At least that's part of our ideology is that might be possible. And a lot of you tug on the threads of where did that part come from? Because obviously the early Puritans weren't talking about that at Massachusetts Bay, and the Virginians might be talking about it only applying to a small subset. But it's funny enough, the Dutch settlement zone around New York City, that's where you start hearing about the self-made people moving up in society.
You don't say.
Funny enough, right? Because in the Dutch colonial world, like all of the people who would become the most powerful families, the Schuylers and such here in this zone, you go back to their parents and grandparents when they arrived, they're all like nothing. And it was possible in New Netherland to work yourself from nothing to being the richest, most influential person in the colony in a lifetime, at a time when that wasn't possible in a lot of places. It was possible in the Dutch zone because they allowed for that. It was all about commerce, making the buck, being more efficient, and not a lot of those constraints on what individual is going to be able to do each of those things. It wasn't very democratic. You didn't have self-government and the company told you what to do. But I think a lot of that sort of material strain that you can rise up and become something else and reinvent yourself and move upwards, a lot of those footings come from this Dutch settlement zone.
Well, we got into this talking about originally the pirates and their view on slavery, and how you said it was kind of a mixed bag, went both ways on certain things.
Yeah. So we sort of set the landscape for it.
Yes.
But so pirates, a third of pirate crews often were of African descent,
and was my next question. Yeah. Wow, that high?
So if you were a black person, you could be welcomed into pirate crews as an equal, and some of them rose to be officers and indeed pirate captains and commodores.
Progressive pirates.
That was entirely possible to do. And that wasn't true in a lot of places. And word got out that you could become an equal human in the pirate crews among enslaved people in Bermuda and Jamaica and Barbados and the other colonies. And we know that because when you go to the National Archives in Kew and you look at the letters from the governor of Barbados and the governor of Bermuda once the pirate outbreak, that's exactly what they're saying. The slaves have heard that the pirates allow people to join. They're waiting. There's rumor that my slaves and my colonial possession are going to rise up if the pirates come, that they're planning to make this a second Nassau. They were terrified the existing order and incredibly destabilizing. And people there were runaway slave societies, like in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. There were all sorts of people who'd escaped from the plantations who had an alternate society way up on the mountains that were, for generations trying to live, out there where they couldn't be captured. A lot of people were starting to come, Maroons they were called, and were coming to Nassau and adding themselves to the pirate crews. So that's the plus side of the ledger. The downside is also the pirates there's all these instances where they capture a slave ship and they take all the enslaved people they find and sell them as cargo, as things, right? Or give them back to the slaveholder as if they were bales of hay.
So sometimes a crew that could include African
exactly
pirates
that. Right. So what's going on with that? I mean, we don't know for sure, but one hypothesis that matches all the evidence we have goes like this, that whether or not the pirates regarded somebody as a full-fledged human or as property was cultural, perhaps, rather than just racial.
What do you mean?
If somebody was what they called a Creole, somebody was of African descent, but born and raised in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, knew the technologies here, spoke the language, they're one of us and can be human. And if they're literally somebody we just found in the hold who's speaking some bizarre language we've never heard of from Central Africa, we other them and treat them as cargo, right? That it's cultural. These people are alien others, and, you know, people, black or not, who are, you know, fellow sailors and, you know Port Royal and know how to operate this vessel are
They're
equal
on
members
the
of
team.
the crew. Right.
Yeah.
And that seems to match when you look at all the evidence and all the contradictions and you say, well, could this be true? It seems to match pretty well. I mean, individuals are going to shift all over the place, but I think that was what's going on is people who are in the Americas were eligible, but there was a othering of the people who were just arriving. Yeah.
Who came from the same place originally.
Oh, originally, right.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, but, you know, like, as we know, you know, race is socially constructed and all that. So
Yeah.
it's like, you know, they're foreigners as opposed to that sorting of status and peoplehood and race, again, was still in flux. In some places it was locked down like Barbados, and in other places it hadn't happened yet. And the pirates are operating in that sphere. So,
All right, so mixed bag on the race issue there.
exactly. They're not there yet.
Yeah. But, I mean, in some ways, they're progressive compared to the time period, I guess.
Relative to what was happening around them, the zone of freedom and the possibility of being free and equal was probably greater on the pirate vessels in Nassau than almost anywhere else in the Caribbean basin in the Americas at the time.
On the gender issue, though,
Yeah.
is my understanding is that at the time, there was no such thing as like a woman sailor on any of these, but for the pirates, there were woman pirates?
Yeah, well, that's the received understanding that we all have is that women were considered bad luck on ships, and that if you had
What?
if you had a woman on a ship, the ship will sink, and you know you can't have women crew members, and there's a whole like nautical lore about that.
God.
And that you couldn't have women crew members, you know, for both gender assumptions, but also because of curse and folklore and stuff. Except that, like, when you go to the National Archives in Kew and you start reading some of the letters, you know, some people who were attacked by the pirates and stuff, like when Calico Jack Rackham goes out. Calico Jack goes out pirating. Now you know where it comes from. He, one of the first vessels he captures, the testimony given at trial is from the master of the vessel, who's a woman.
The master of the vessel was a woman?
Yeah, it's like a little coastal trading vessel with like 2 or 3 people on it or something like that. But
they gave her a small one.
She's in charge. Yeah, but she's in charge of it, and she's sailing around. But this is again said without any comment. Like, it's not considered strange. It's just matter of fact that the master of this vessel was a woman who was so.
A little forgotten history there.
Yeah, so I think the situation was probably more porous than we imagine. And certainly the pirates did include a few women, most famously Mary Read and Anne Bonny, whose story was popularized in that 1724 book I mentioned, The General History of the Pirates. But they were people who really existed because they got brought to trial, and there were indictments against them. They were in history. They were from the accounts that we have from the actual records. They dressed as men and swore.
They dressed as men.
They dressed as, maybe that's not unusual, in that would you try to be a sailor wearing a dress or whatever you're supposed to be wearing,
that
but
makes sense.
Dressed as men and cursed and talked like the men and fought and had the weapons with them, and they were just as scary and fierce as the male pirates. And that's what we know from the accounts of their victims that made it to trial.
Was Mary the Irish one, or was that Anne?
I don't think we really know where either of them were from, and that's a whole fraught thing. There's people who say that they have proof that, one of them, so they pled their bellies, as they say at trial. In other words, they were pregnant when they got brought to trial, and they were found guilty of piracy, but they couldn't be executed while pregnant. That was against the law. You couldn't execute a pregnant person. You had to wait
That's
till
nice
they
of
weren't
the
pregnant anymore, and then execute them. But one of them, there's no account of them actually ever being. They were imprisoned in Jamaica. There's no account of them actually ever, no record of them dying or being executed or anything else. They just kind of poof from the
Ooh.
records, which has led to all kinds of speculation and theories and people pulling up evidence to say, oh, she's really this person who ended up back in Charleston. This was her dad, and no, that person was. And so there's a bit of a mystery as to whether Anne Bonny survived. Mary Read, we know where she was died on this date and was interred in this cemetery in prison. I think died in prison of illness, if I remember right. But Anne Bonny is kind of a mystery. And then there's the Anne Bonny child. And Anne Bonny.
Do they have a bloodline to this day?
Depends on who you ask. I'm going to be speaking off the top of my head, not having thought about this in a few years. But
and we're going to judge you on every word.
Right. So somebody has claims. This is a little murky, but the general story is somebody has claimed that they have all the records proving that they or somebody they know is descended from Anne Bonny, and here's the chain. It involves this person and that person. But no, you can't see the records yourself. They're over here. No, they're over there. Where did you find them? I found them here. No, I found them. There's alleged records that are quoted from, but nobody has been allowed to review the actual things to see for themselves and judge their provenance. And as I recall, shifting stories as to where they came from and when. So it's a bit of a mystery, but seems a little sus.
How did the two of them gain respect, and how much power did they end up getting as pirates? Like, did they get to a point where each of them had their own crews? Like, how did they rise up as a woman? Yeah,
from the historical records, as opposed to sort of, mythic stories laid down in the general history, what we know is that they were, Anne Bonny came with her husband to the Pirate Republic. Her husband, James Bonny, was one of the pirates there. She was there for a number of years as part of this pirate society. She only pops up once or twice in the records, but we know that they were there. And then towards the end of the piracy outbreak, Calico Jack Rackham decides to steal a vessel in the harbor, the fastest sloop in the harbor. He's going to grab it and go on a pirate rampage. And he takes Anne Bonny and Mary Read with him. It's essentially the three of them, I think, or maybe there's 5 pirates, but they're a large chunk or the majority of the crew. And they take off on this little vessel and start raiding vessels around Jamaica, the approaches to Jamaica. And carries on for a little bit, and they're, all those accounts of them, wearing men's clothing and threatening people and having, being competent in battle and scaring everybody. They don't actually have to fight anybody or kill anybody because the terror campaign works. Like, everybody surrenders. But they end up getting caught and brought to trial in Jamaica ultimately, and end up imprisoned. So you work your way backwards from that information, and you know that they somehow had combat skills. They somehow knew how to be pirates. They wanted to set out on their own with Calico Jack and go out and do all of this stuff. We don't know why, but they were there and, wanted to live the merry life in a short one in the role of pirates.
When you say pirates of this era got caught like them, I'm trying to picture this because it's still like the Wild West over there. You have a basic governor of the island set up, but it's not like, they have a police force working 12-hour shifts or stuff. And as you said, on the seas, it's wide open, and it's generally a easy job for them to take something, so it's not like they're the ones getting taken. So is it the kind of thing where, like, when they're laying their head to bed at night, like, there are some soldiers or something that come and get them based on a tip, or how did that usually go down?
Yeah, so if you're in Nassau, you're pretty safe because the fort's protecting things, so they could sleep easily. So that was their home base and their sanctuary. But anywhere else out there, you're always in danger. And the time you're in most danger is when you need to maintain your vessel, go ashore, get more water and stuff. There, the underside of wooden sailing vessels back before copper-based bottom paints, kelp and seaweeds and stuff would start growing all over the bottom and quickly make your vessel slower and slower. which means you could get caught, you can't maneuver, you can't catch other vessels. You had to occasionally bring the vessel at low tide on a beach with the right angle and careen it. You had to tip it over, let the tide go out so it's exposed, and then laboriously clean all the stuff and gunk that had been growing on the hull off it, and then refloat it again. You have to do that every few months, or you're going to get caught and killed anyway. So you also, if you're had any damage from a storm or damage in battle or something wore out, you need to go actually like remove masts, or you need to shift cargo, or you captured another vessel and you need to transfer all the treasure. And hey, the vessel has cannon on it. We need to move the cannon onto our vessel. We need to make our vessel able to accommodate 12 guns instead of 10 cannon. We need to get the ship's carpenter working. What I'm saying is there's all kinds of times when you're out, for months or weeks, operating hundreds or 1,000 miles from Nassau, where you need to hide out and do your rest and recuperation and water and maintenance and all that.
And in those times, soldiers may
Those are the dangers, is that a Royal Navy vessel or somebody happens upon you in your hiding place. And so a lot of the captures are there. They're happened upon while they're trying to recharge their batteries, basically. That most of the big pirate captures were in those circumstances.
Also, I just thought of this. I should have asked this like at the outset, but what was the historical basis of the term pirate? Like, when did we first start actually using it?
Oh, I mean, I think that word's been around for hundreds of years. I'm not sure. I mean, that'd be like, go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look for the etymology.
Meaning before these people.
Yeah, way before these people, yeah. No, that pirates, one form or another, had existed for centuries. In the English language, where did the term come from? I'm actually not sure. It's probably, I mean, the word is very similar in Spanish, and again, there'd been pirates in the medieval period and in the ancient world and all the rest, so...
Yeah, I'm going to see, unless he's pulling it up.
Yeah, let's pull up.
The word pirate originates in the 1300s. Yeah, you're not kidding. From the Latin word pirata, meaning sea robber, and was also a Latin synonym for the word peril. In Greek, the word came from pirates, meaning one who attacks. Pirating is distinguished from the historic concept of privateering, which is, you already went through all that. Okay, so when they had, like you said, there were literal piracy laws when these people are being brought onto trial, so it was already a term at that point.
Oh, yeah.
But it stretched back way before.
Yeah, the Golden Age pirates aren't bringing... But what they bring that's new isn't piracy itself. It's the argument that we're not just mere pirates in the sense that we're criminals. The argument is that we're doing this, we're Robin Hood's men. We're doing this for ideological reasons as well. We're not simple brigands. We're leading a social revolution against the man who's been ruining our lives. And that sets them apart and causes so much of the public to back them and agree with them and makes them much more dangerous. That ethos that you actually have runaway slaves streaming in and the threats of slave rebellion terrorizing the governors of Bermuda and Jamaica and elsewhere, that's all because of this additional ethos that's beyond, hey, we're just common criminals.
You mentioned that Blackbeard cultivated this aura of being a terrorist, but in reality, he didn't. Do you say he didn't kill people at all? Yeah,
that's the amazing thing. So yeah, he's incredibly scary. He has these lighted fuses going and smoke bug above his head, and he's got all these weapons, and his crew are all wearing their trophies. But you actually go back to the records, and remember, all the records we have of Blackbeard's career as a pirate come from his victims. So they're not sympathetic to him at all. These are the people who give depositions after Blackbeard's captured their ship and stole their stuff and maybe let them go or whatever, but it's all from the victim's point of view. There is not one documented instance of him killing or harming anybody prior to his final fatal battle with the Royal Navy in 1718. Zero.
As opposed to like Henry Jennings, who did kill people.
Henry Jennings did, yeah, and Charles Vane would be pretty sadistic.
Yes.
But Blackbeard especially, not a one. There's, we probably have documentation with an eyewitness account of, 20, probably at least 25 vessels captured. So,
whoa.
Yeah. And you start comparing that to the world they operated in. I mean, this is an era when, a kid stealing bread in London, it's a capital offense, and they execute them.
Yeah.
And people are going around, collecting orphans and forcing them to be human chimney sweeps, climbing up chimneys until they fall to their deaths or whatever. I mean, it's a brutal time period. And when you actually look at how discreet people like Blackbeard and Bellamy and Hornigold to various extents were about the use of violence, it becomes even more impressive because it's such a violent time period, even in the ordered legal use of violence. It's such a brutal time.
So the reason I bring that up is because then my question is, some of these guys, not the Henry Jennings of the world, but other ones, do you see an argument for them kind of legitimately being Robin Hood type figures and not just being evil pirates?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, they are. It's not like they're stealing the stuff and giving it to the poor. I mean, they're considering themselves to be the representatives of the poor.
So they did no type of redistribution to other people. But they did share equally in many ways along their cruise.
Among their society of pirates, they're redistributing for sure. But it's not I mean, I don't think there'd even be a mechanism for them to steal the money and like go find paupers in some village ashore because they get captured. But their incentives, their selfish incentives and their ideology probably overlap. But yeah, absolutely, especially given the way that they revolutionized and leveled and democratized government in their own ships is pretty interesting for that time period. And Sam Bellamy literally claims to be Robin Hood's men. He says those words in a famous speech overheard by one of his captives. And
we actually have to talk about him. We haven't talked about him a ton today. He's come up like intermittently, but this was the guy from Cape Cod.
Yeah,
is that right?
Whydah fame. The Whydah is his famous ship and wreck that was destroyed in Cape Cod.
What was his full backstory?
Yeah, so he came from the West Country of England. People have located his likely birthplace and parents and name and all that kind of stuff. Like a lot of these pirates, you first appears in the historical record beyond his just birth dates when he enters piracy. But he came with a whole backstory. In Cape Cod folklore, going back, a couple centuries, there's a story that Sam Bellamy came to Cape Cod from England and that he met a local girl, Maria Hallett, 16, 17, 18, something like that. They fell in love, and then he set off to find his fortune and then was trying to return to her after getting his pirate fortune when his ship is destroyed off Cape Cod. And she goes,
that sounds
mad.
A little cleanly tied together.
Yeah, well, it's nice folk story, right? So what we do know about Sam Bellamy, we don't know if he was in Cape Cod, but we do know that he appears in the historical record right after that Spanish treasure fleet in 1715 is destroyed on the treasure coast of Florida. And he is among the people who show up to try to pick and salvage Spanish treasure.
How did he get involved in that? Did someone pay him to do that? He
shows up with another guy, Palsgrave Williams, who I mentioned before, who's the son of Rhode Island's Attorney General. And actually Palsgrave Williams' stepfather is a Scotsman and family involved in the Jacobite uprising, and they're also embedded in a family in Block Island in Rhode Island, involved in all kinds of fencing of pirate goods, and they're deeply involved in the underworld trade.
All the way up there, fencing.
Oh yeah, definitely. So Captain Kidd, with his treasure, when he was on the run previously, a privateer forced into piracy, he ends up in Block Island and in Newport to fence his goods as well. There's a well-known, the sort of Cayman Islands of the time period to go have your goods and your
these
bankers
guys weren't Italians?
Not at that time period.
Damn.
Rhode Islanders.
So they weren't the first up there. Because I know today, a couple guys named Vinny and Paul up there.
There's also Gardiner's Island was also where Kidd and Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams end up, which is
Gardiner's Island?
Yeah, the forks on the end of Long Island. There's two forks of land spit, and there's an island right in the middle of it, Gardiner's Island.
Gardiner's.
Gardiner's. Yeah, you can even find it with the right keyword searches. Your audience can find stuff from the New York Times just a few years ago of the Lord Proprietors of the Gardiner's Island, the last of whom I think only recently died. So the Gardiner's Island
Lord
was
Proprietors
the king gave this island to a particular family, and that feudal grant was passed down as a noble title until very recently.
Oh, this is like prime real estate.
The prime real estate in one family has controlled it for like 400 years. And
how many people live on it?
Oh, I don't think anybody other than
Except
the
the
families and their retainers and things, I'm pretty sure.
Oh my
I mean, I
God.
know more about this island in 1715 than I do about now, but I know that the 14th proprietor, whoever he is, there's like a New York Times article from 7-8 years ago about the battle over the inheritance of the island and all
This
of that.
sounds like True Detective season 6.
So Captain Kidd came here and deposited his treasure. These are like the bankers, right? These are the bankers to the mob were involved back in the previous generations
Sure.
there. And Sam Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams are all tied up in that. So what I'm saying is there were places people knew they could go, an underworld black market banking systems or offshore kind of, banking and protection where you could keep your stuff in your Swiss bank account, so to speak. It would be kept for you by various individuals who you could trust.
So the pirates would go way up there. They'd go way outside.
Oh, they were raiding all the way to Newfoundland. They were regularly. So there's seasonal. It might be based in the Bahamas, but you'd be up raiding ships in the approaches to Boston and New York Harbor and the Capes
in the
of
summer
Virginia
and stuff.
in the summer. And then you don't want to be around the Bahamas in hurricane season, so you time things in that way. And then you'd be off in the Spanish Main at other times a year, and they moved around. Yeah, they had their theater of operations extended, from Venezuela to Newfoundland.
But they're so far away from their base, their safe base of Nassau. Now, like you said, there's some little places like Gardiner's Island or something where it's like, okay, you're a friend here, but you're
constantly looking for pirate hideouts. So, and there were a lot of them, right? So you could go. There were little islands in the Caribbean island chain where people knew that you could hide out, but also the Cape Fear area in North Carolina. There's a lot of lore and stuff where pirates would go into those creeks and stuff, and you could hide out where your masts couldn't be seen from the sea, and you could do your R&R there. And especially the coast of Maine. A lot of these pirates ended up there. Sam Bellamy was trying to get to Maine when his ship went down off Cape Cod. We know that because he was traveling in a fleet of ships that he was leading, and the other ships that survived the storm all ended up on the Maine coast in Monhegan and Damerscove Island trying to find each other. They'd been scattered by the storm. Others had gone up to eastern Maine, headed towards the Canada border. Why would you do that? Well, because like Cape Fear, these were places that eastern half of today's Maine had been contested for centuries between France and England. It was sort of a no man's land. And in this time period, there'd just been this continent-spanning war between England and France. And this was a place where there was no government authority. There was no one other than indigenous people kicking around to see what you were doing, and hundreds of islands and coves and places to hide out. And so they would go to places like Eastern Maine or like Cape Fear, North Carolina, where they knew that they could hide, do their R&R without any authorities being around. North Carolina had also been had a devastating colonist v. indigenous people conflict, and was depopulated by European colonial officials. And
When
so
was
you could
this?
go there. That war concluded, 1710 or 12, if I remember right. It devastated North Carolina, which is part of the reason, if we get into Blackbeard's story, that Blackbeard would be welcomed in North Carolina when he decides to try to set himself up as a sort of Tony Soprano-like figure.
Right before Blackbeard, though, you said Bellamy obviously dies in that wreck.
Yeah, so Bellamy, what we know of his story, he and Palsgrave Williams show up in 1715, salvaging treasure. He ends up in Nassau. He serves in the cruise with Hornigold, and ultimately sets out on his own and is able to capture one of these swift frigate-size slave ships. He captures it after it's unloaded its slaves, when it's loaded with treasure. And so he has this incredible treasure in the holds, and he captures the ship and goes on a brief reign of terror and is headed northward. He captures a ship in the Caribbean, and he and Palsgrave Williams and his fleet are headed north to hide out in Maine. And off the Cape Cod, they get hit with a storm, much like the Spanish treasure fleet did, and the ship is destroyed, and Bellamy and most of his crew are killed in that. Few people survive, but not many.
And he wasn't that old when he died, right?
Oh, he was like 27 or something like that.
Wow. He's already running like a fleet.
Yeah, so the lore goes that he died trying to get back to Cape Cod to see Maria Hallett, which seems a little pat, but The late Ken Kinker, a historian who studied the Bellamy wreck and the Whydah in great detail, he was based in Cape Cod, and he dug in local records and found a woman named Mary Hallett, who would have been the right age, 18, 19 in this time period, whose family owned and operated the tavern in the area in Eastham, which is exactly where a sailor would show up and maybe meet somebody. And she died, consistent with legend, at an older age, unmarried, without kids, at a time when that was pretty unusual.
Yeah.
So, that's enough coincidences with the folk story to lead you to not completely dismiss the folk story, because some specifics are there. Who knows? It's only passed down in oral tradition, but I think there's something to it, probably, at least in general terms.
Well, looking at these maps we've been pulling up with some of these places, be it like a Gardener's Island, which sounds like some old world backdoor, boardroom type shit. Like, you think about all these different places. We got Cape Fear up there right now.
Yeah.
Where there's still some mystery around them, and there still is like these underbellies that could exist. And again, you heard me mention it a few minutes ago, not to get like too stereotypical, but I think like True Detective Season 1 did an amazing job showing that, making Louisiana this like the actual place, like a character. Because they're like, these places are off the beaten
did the
trail.
Latest one with Jodie Foster in Alaska. That was very place driven.
I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. The place is the star of the show, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's a pretty cool thing. But like, these are more modern day type things where this is still this way. I had this other guy in here, Tim McBride, who was a pirate. Mm-hmm. But he's a modern day pirate. He was like the biggest mover of pot in the 80s in the United States. And it was out of this little place in Florida. If we scroll down, unless you just go down to Florida, called Chokoloskee Island. It's below Naples on the west coast.
Uh-huh.
Yep, there you go. And this little area, when you listen to him describe it, he was in his 20s, the godfather of this whole operation. It's just this off the beaten path, quiet little town. They pull in pillars worth of weed and put it on all these little boats and scatter around like little roaches and hide it in their little houses and then give it to the Cubans. And I'm like, this is today. Like, not today, but like not that long ago. Like, there's still these
things. Pirates walk among us.
Yes, they can exactly. It can still kind of exist in small ways, which seems crazy in a world like we have right now.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's definitely that sort of the underworld of things that aren't legal that people move into, absolutely. Which eventually leads to, once you get really organized, into the organized crime syndicates and all the rest.
Oh, yeah. Now, you were saying there was some of Blackbeard's story you wanted to get to a few minutes ago.
Oh, Blackbeard.
You're talking about Cape Fear and stuff with him.
Right. So Blackbeard, sometimes people ask, who's your favorite pirate is sometimes a question that comes up. And I usually go at Blackbeard because what I find really interesting about him is he's clearly the thinking person's pirate. And you can see how he worked out his performative, terrifying person image in order to secure what he wanted. And when you're watching like his movements, and you're tracking his movements through the records, and you figure out that he learned information X at this moment, and then what did he do next? He suddenly goes off and does this thing. He's always like planning ahead and trying to work out the angles several steps ahead of time. And when the golden age of piracy is clearly coming to a close, when it's clear that Nassau and the Pirate Republic's days are numbered, Blackbeard has this audacious scheme. So in short, the Woodes Rogers, the hero of the War of Spanish Secession, decides to use his political capital that he's gained by capturing the treasure galleon and becoming a hero to approach the king and the court with a plan that goes, hey, I'll take my private frigates I built to circumnavigate the world, and you back me up with some Royal Navy vessels, and I'll go take out these pirates for you. And if I do it, you'll make me governor of the Bahamas if I can hold the place. And the only thing I need from you is to pardon the pirates, to issue a pardon to anyone who will agree to step down from piracy and surrender without a fight will be absolved of all their criminality for piracy.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So he was
Divide
kind
and
of
conquer.
playing both sides.
Well, he wanted to divide and conquer. He wanted to weaken the pirates enough to take control of the place. Of course, the pirates could go back into piracy. So
Sure.
once you've taken control, you're in a vulnerable situation. But word got out that the king had issued this pardon. Here's, oh my gosh, all these pirates who had thought that they had stepped off, into a life of criminality that would almost certainly end in the noose or death, suddenly had a second chance where they could take all their ill-gotten gains and return to society. Incredibly tempting. Well, when this news reaches Blackbeard, he's not in Nassau. He's out on patrol when he encounters this information. And what he does next, he tries to get one final big score because he's been unlucky. All the ships he's captured have like tar in them and, hides.
Did you uncover this part in your research? I'm sorry to cut you off. Or was this something someone else had found?
Well, I would say following the track day by day to reassemble where he was at and what he's learned was new.
Okay.
Different chunks of information were known, but I don't think they were ever strung together. I think what I added was stringing them together in a better way and adding more beads along the way that shows you the string. So some of it was there.
Okay, so you were saying he finds out this information.
Yeah, so he tries to go into the Gulf of Mexico and like capture this massive prestige treasure ship, and he's just unlucky. He ends up in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he's got to figure out what to do then. And his crew is really angry because they don't have lots of money. They need to accept the king's pardon pretty quick, or the deadline will run out and they'll lose their chance.
Wait, accept the part. All right, now I'm confused. There was a decree then that was said just...
If you go show up at a governor, show up at an English governor, he can give you a pardon for your crimes, and then you have to step down from piracy.
It wasn't like if Woods actually captured you or something, now you get it. It's like, no, here's an announcement, like an APB.
In advance, if you all will surrender, and you can keep your treasure, and we'll call it even. But from now on, you can't be pirates. That's the deal, right?
Okay.
But everyone has to go to a governor and an English governor and accept a pardon. So he's trying to get a final score of treasure. Can't do it. Raids off Charleston. He's working his way up the coast. So what does he do? He strategically ditches most of his crew. He takes his flagship, a giant frigate-sized vessel, and intentionally runs it aground, abandons all the crewmen he doesn't trust, jumps into a smaller vessel, and keeps only his trusted allies, the majority of whom, by the way, are of African descent, and goes up. And where does he go? He goes to North Carolina, to the cheapest, lamest colony out there, a place that has almost no people, that's just been ravaged in a conflict with the indigenous people, a place that the Virginians look down on as a place where, ne'er-do-wells and people of no consequence live, where there's not even really a capital. The government just moves around from village to village. But the best thing they have for a capital is a little town called Bath in North Carolina, which is kind of in the northeast. You probably even have to Google search it. It's way up Pamlico Sound. And he goes there and finds the governor and basically works out a deal. And the deal is, hey, give me a pardon. And in exchange, I'm just involved in the sanitation business, right? Everything's fine. I just found this big parcel of treasure in the ship floating out at sea. Here, I'll sell it to you, and you can keep the proceeds. And that'll be great, right?
Yeah.
So he sets himself up to basically have the protection of the governor, to claim that he is now just an ordinary citizen in North Carolina. And North Carolina is so impoverished and so lacking in any people of like soldiers and stuff to defend the colony. Suddenly, his crew almost doubles the population of Bath when they show up and come ashore. And they're all armed and all the rest. So he works out this deal.
They're all like African Americans too.
Some of them are, yeah.
A lot of them.
And North Carolina, again, was also one of those places like the Bahamas where that consolidation of the race and slavery had to happen. South Carolina, totally. North Carolina was and the Bahamas had the same proprietors, and it was,
Got it. Okay. Makes sense.
So that allowed for that as well to be occurring. So he's going out down Pamlico Sound, which you see on that map, and goes and attacks some French ships in the open ocean and brings them back to one of the barrier islands at the mouth of the Sound, Ocracoke Island, and is dismantling the vessels. He's raiding other vessels, and all the treasure and proceeds is ending up in the collector of customs for North Carolina's barn under a pile of hay. And so he's basically worked out to be a protected, he's bought the cops and he's bought the mayor, and he's kind of running the show there.
Good businessman.
Perfect, right? It's better than piracy. I've got piracy with government protecting me. What he doesn't count on is the ruthlessness of the governor of Virginia, who's going to have none of it.
A politician ruthless? Come on.
Governor Spotswood in Virginia, who looks down on North Carolinians to begin with, has absolutely no jurisdiction in North Carolina, but furious at Blackbeard's raids, which are imperiling shipping just to the north at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay and to the Virginia colony, the Capes of Virginia. He conspires with the captains of the Royal Navy vessels there in Norfolk to set up two impromptu mercenary raiding parties. One set travels overland of soldiers through the Great Dismal Swamp south from Virginia to attack Bath from land, while another set uses a bunch of sloops and sails down around Ocracoke Island to come in up Pamlico Sound and trap him so that there'll be no escape. And they find him off Ocracoke Island in that sound. He and his men have just had a crazy party on the ship, and they're drunk and hungover and don't even notice these small vessels approaching them. And then there's this enormous battle. There's a boarding action, and it's all the stuff in the Errol Flynn pirate movies is all borrowed from this crazy battle.
Just that.
Yeah. But there's a sword fights, and there's a dashing lieutenant of the Royal Navy vessels, and he and Blackbeard are engaged in a fight, and then eventually Blackbeard and his crew actually lose, and he's killed and beheaded, and his body brought back to.
They beheaded him on the ship right there?
Yes, and they kept.
They didn't make him walk the plank?
They put the head in the bowsprit and brought it home to Norfolk, where it was
a good touch.
Put on a post on one of the shores of what's now Norfolk.
So much for the
Blackbeard Point, I think it's called today.
Fitting, but so much for the pardon.
Exactly. Well, and all of that was incredibly illegal, right? And doing any of those things, and the proceeds from the seizing of Blackbeard's vessel, right? North Carolina was like, no, you can't just take this stuff and bring it to Virginia and divide it among these Royal Navy crew people. It resulted in lawsuits, and everybody got in trouble. And the dashing lieutenant wasn't promoted to captain for another 35 years. So it caused a whole brouhaha. But essentially, the ruthlessness in the governor of Virginia led to Blackbeard's demise when he thought he was safe. But he planned it out, right? He figured out a whole scheme to set himself up, right?
He tried, didn't work out. What happened to the sociopath, Charles Vane? Whatever became of him?
Yeah, so when the end for the Pirate Republic comes when Woodes Rogers and his frigates and several Royal Navy vessels all arrive in Nassau Harbor. There's been a previous visit by the Royal Navy to get some pardons, but essentially there's this moment where everyone's not sure what's going to happen, and he comes ashore, and most of the pirates are going to accept the pardon, at least in the short term. Some don't, especially Charles Vane, who's like, not only refuses to do that, in the middle of the night, he sets a merchant ship on fire and sails it right at the Royal Navy vessels to try to catch them in a giant fireball, a fire ship, and destroy them. And then, takes off in a sloop out the back, and he's pursued. And Charles Vane refuses all that, and keeps rampaging like a barbarian to the bitter end, refusing to give up piracy or surrender in any form.
And then he gets killed. That's usually how it goes. The can or the kill.
Merry life for a short one, yeah.
Yeah. So that concludes like the golden era, that 1715, 1725-ish era.
Right. So, Woodes Rogers comes ashore in 1718. It's a long battle because a lot of the pirates are going back into piracy. All of his soldiers he brings with him are catching tropical diseases and falling over and dying, and he's vulnerable the whole time. Then a war resumes with Spain, and it lasts on a knife's edge, and pirates like Vane and others are still out there returning to piracy. But as a threat to the empires, which the Republic of Pirates had become, it's kind of over in 1718, and the last tendrils by 1720 in the Caribbean are gone, and by 1725, even those who escaped to the Indian Ocean, the African theater, have been pretty much rounded up.
So are you saying this is kind of the end of piracy in the Caribbean in general?
This kind of piracy of the skull and crossbones variety, where the pirates were arguing that they were, fighting the establishment, were Robin Hood's men, that's where that reaches its end.
So
now, there'll be other
how did
pirates later. I mean,
yeah,
like
how
Jean
did it
Lafitte's of the
transform?
world and all the rest. But, so once the Pirate Republic was gone and there was no longer this haven, individual pirates could just be picked off eventually. The storm takes them out, or they need provisions and can't get any, and they can't maintain their vessel, and they can't sell their stuff. They don't have an infrastructure, the infrastructure of state to allow them to fence goods and protect themselves. So eventually they, get unlucky, or they, slink off, and disband their company and disappear into the woodwork. But either way, you don't have the kind of empire hobbling threat to commerce.
Really ever again?
Right. Ever again in the age of sail. So that, the Pirate Republic, because it was straddling that key sea lane, that basically if you were in the eastern half of the Caribbean, the western half of the Caribbean and Mexico and that entire basin, and you wanted to go back to Europe with your stuff, you basically, because of the direction of the winds, you had to go through the Straits of Florida right by the Bahamas. And they were able to grab all these vessels, and once they got these frigate-sized vessels like the Whydah and like Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, they had the Royal Navy on the run, right? Their ships were as big as any Royal Navy frigate attached to defend the posts in the Americas, and their ships were better maintained than the Royal Navy's, and they had more men for boarding actions. I mean, they were running the show for a brief period of a couple of years. The commerce of the empires was paralyzed. It was an actual threat, not only to the British colonial space, but the French and the Dutch and everyone else. That would never be the case again, where you had an actual destabilizing of the empires of that sort. There's only like a 2-year window where it was really threatening to
When was that?
shake things up. 1717 and 1718 would be the times when things got so bad that, huge numbers of ships are being grabbed all at once trying to leave New York or leave Virginia, and, just making it almost impossible to keep the affairs of the empire and commerce and the mercantile system going.
Yeah, because when we talk about, fast forward to today, you hear me mention Tim McBride and things like that, but when we talk about like pirate, in I guess more the folklore sense today, it's all in like Somalia, not even here. And that's, you and I were talking off camera, that's just because there's a tight international shipping port there. It's a very, very poor area, so economic incentive says that there's going to be bandits, and the bandits come and they take the shipping.
And they've got just like the pirates in the Bahamas in the Golden Age, they've got a sort of failed state base in each circumstance. So in Indonesia and in the straits there, where that piracy would rise up, you have a commerce coming in and out of large parts of Asia has to go through those straits, and in parts of Sumatra that have beef with the Indonesian government, the pirates are considered heroes, and local people raiding and settling scores to help the local population who are oppressed. And in Somalia, during all of that period of piracy, right, there's another failed state where outside, like European fishing vessels, offshore factory freezer vessels, have been coming and scooping up all their fish illegally and wiping out the livelihoods of all the ordinary artisanal fishers of that area. And you had the collapse of the state, and the pirates are going to move in and settle some scores, right? And bring all this stuff ashore in this place that had been destroyed by the outsiders. Well, we'll show the outsiders. We'll go take their ships. And so they had, entire towns that are, the pirates were kind of running, and where they were supported, and have all of that shoreside support that you need in order to be a lasting threat. And it started damaging shipping and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know as much about the current stuff in Yemen with these groups who are backed by giving weapons by Iran, but look what they've done to
the
global
Houthis.
shipping.
Yep.
What I don't know is there locally there in their place? Do they have the backing of the people in quotes locally for some reason or not? I don't know. But if they are to be sustained for a long period, you probably need that kind of like
they have
social support
Iran.
mechanism.
They have Iran.
They have Iran, but you need like the central government in Yemen to either be happy with them or be so dysfunctional that they can create their own like pirate nest with all of that necessary infrastructure to sustain themselves.
Yeah, I don't want to mess this up trying to explain this as not the expert on it, but I had my friend Joby Warwick in here recently, who's like 2-time Pulitzer winner.
He knows it.
Oh my God, he's done the Middle East for the last 25 years of his life. So he put on this masterclass of like the state of the Middle East. Where's Iran's nuclear program these days?
I'm really concerned about that, and I've been watching it for, about 15 years. And for the longest time, the concern was that, well, Iran says it doesn't want a nuclear weapon, but gee, they're sure accumulating a lot of fissile materials, the stuff you make that explodes in a nuclear bomb. In the last 3 years, we've seen a pretty big change with the Iranians. They're now making not just the low-enriched uranium, which they were pretty good at making, the stuff you could put in a nuclear power plant. Now it's high-enriched uranium. It's 60% enriched. It's very, very close to weapons grade. Sort of telling the world that, wink, wink, we could make a bomb if we want to. And that's not just a bluff anymore. They've got...
We spent like an hour and 10 minutes on Syria, 50 minutes on Yemen, 50, 60 minutes on Iran, and then 45 minutes on Israel and Gaza and all that.
Wow.
And so when we were going through, and he was tying them all together, which was pretty cool, but when we were going through Yemen, he talked about how it's such a, I mean, this is not a good comparison, but you were talking about how when the U.S. was colonized and stuff, there were all these different like sectors and beliefs.
Yeah.
I want to say it's a similar type idea with some radicalism, obviously, and some outer nation funding that happens in Yemen, but like there's no real, from my understanding, and correct me in the comments if I'm misinterpreting this, there's not a core central control there. It's kind of insane. So my takeaway would be, based on some of the piracy talks we had about what they're doing on the high seas, is that, yeah, they do have a clear base in some area of the country to be able to do that by those ports.
And that's the formula for pirates to become a threat of, more geopolitical rather than local,
right?
Consequence.
Right. Now, at the beginning of this conversation, you were starting to ruin my life, or maybe stop on some of the Pirates of the Caribbean stuff. But we got to go all the way there.
Oh
now,
yeah.
Because I grew up on that shit. I loved it. It's great movies. But I know it's Hollywood. What are some of the biggest things they got really wrong? I know we started to talk about it earlier, but from an expert opinion, what did they get wrong, and then what parts did they get most right?
Well, I mean, the first movie is the one that starts closest to something reality-ish, and then they just they keep going after the movies often to sort of sort of supernatural
right.
They're not even trying to be real anymore. But if you go to the first movie, the general idea of here's a base. There's rapacious, interests out there. They had it be a, company like the British West India or East India Company or something like that, and that the Jack Sparrow character is kind of poking at that Robin Hood-like. That Jack Sparrow is wearing these sort of flamboyant clothes, and that's real. Like
I am
a lot
a Robin Hood,
right? Like the pirates would, Calico Jack and others would be wearing wealthy people's clothing, and as a statement, right, to kind of throw people off. So some of that is sort of real, and that that twist of the anti-hero has definitely some reality to it. So they start with things that are real-ish, and then they keep on going down. I mean, it becomes a video game pretty quickly, where it's not trying to be.
The fantasy parts, obviously, I know aren't real, but like some of the basis of how the crews operated, where they were doing it. Obviously, they got that right, but you want some of that to be true.
Well, I mean, they all have mixes. I mean, like Black Sails Black Sails, the Star series, started with a much more historically recognizable Nassau as a pirate base, and a lot of the same characters. They have Hornigold in there and Calico Jack. And
I never saw it.
Yeah, it came out in like 2014, and it lasted like 4 seasons. But that one has combines being a true-ish pirate republic of the sort I just described, and they've brought in a bunch of characters who are from the Robert Louis Stevenson Treasure Island, but much earlier when they're young people, and that later they're going to become, so like it becomes a prequel of Treasure Island. At the same time, it's a story of this pirate republic. So it's kind of interesting in that respect. Assassin's Creed 4 I did consulting on, which is a video game.
Oh, shit.
Right, that Ubisoft series, one pretense is they set it in different areas of history, and they try to make the setting as historically valid and real as possible. They try to get the details right. So if, they're supposed to be in ancient Venice, they try to make it like ancient Venice. When they did the one set in the French Revolution, they tried to reproduce what Paris looked like in 1789 to such detail that when Notre Dame burned, guess who had the best digital rendering of Notre Dame for the rebuild from? Ubisoft had it. It's a French company, but they actually are rebuilding it using Ubisoft's giant scans they made for the game because they wanted to be that accurate.
That's cool.
Isn't that a wild? Yeah. Yes. So they
brought you on.
They brought me on because
when was this?
This was 2015 or 16, I think, if I remember right. But they brought me on to do sort of consulting for it because they had recreated with Blackbeard and Bellamy and all these characters, Hornigold, set in Nassau and following pretty closely the actual history. So, some productions and pop culture stuff has gotten really captivated by the idea of this pirate republic, right? It's not just a bunch of people sailing around. It's like a whole society you can play with, which has all kinds of dramatic utility, not to mention budgets. I mean, to be able to have a setting on land for stuff to happen and not have it all be out on ships is also freeing in terms of how you're going to film this thing for season after season.
So it sounds like obviously they care a lot about accuracy, but what does that look like for you? Do you come on and you're sitting like in the writer's room? Are you on their digital, Ubisoft, like sitting in the back rooms creating it digitally with them?
No, it was so there was a lead writer, a guy named Dorey McDevitt, who actually like wrote they hire actors to come in and play the things, and they have the thing with a video capture to move around and stuff. He's a person like writing the cut scenes and writing the lines and all that, and the environment. So I was largely like script consulting, looking through all the details of what was happening, what was being mentioned, when events occurred, would people say this kind of thing or that kind of thing, all those sort of details. And I describe it a little bit like if I'd been brought in the same role for like Mad Men, my role would have been said, no, that secretary wouldn't use that handbag in August 1964. She'd use this one, right? It was that level of trying to get anything that was wrong out there. I'd find references to a town that didn't exist yet, or that had a different name in that time period. They wanted to get that level of detail, right? To have.
Did you lose any battles? Like, did you have some stuff where you're like, wait, no, it's got to be like this, and like, no.
There were little things with game mechanics, like in Nassau, they didn't have docks and things to dock on. They just using the beach, so they'd have to row cargo ashore, which is kind of a pain for them. All the transfers you couldn't just tie up your ocean-going vessel, but they weren't able to do that because they needed the dock as the recognizable way to port yourself from the local setting to being on the ship again. Like that was the visual cue to you that this is your portal to get back on your ship. So things like that would shift around. Yeah.
Are you looking to do some, I know you wrote this a while ago, but are you looking to do some more historical research on pirates again?
Yeah, I can't quite let go. I went back the following year and we added a bonus chapter a few years in with some more details that I discovered. And I went back yet again. I've got another, I was in London about 10, 11 months ago, and I've got, another hundreds of images that may track down into solving some more mysteries about this person or that person. But yeah, I need a few extra weeks to sit down and transcribe all these things to really dig in. But yeah, it's always fascinating, and I try to keep an eye out on all of the discoveries and scholarship that anyone else is making to keep current on what's, known and being found. I think the big discoveries that remain to be made about these Golden Age pirates probably lie in the French and Spanish records.
Why do you say that?
Well, the English ones, I think we've probably mined most of the ore that's out there. I've been pretty thorough in 3 trips, and other scholars have done that, and it's in English, so it's and the National Archives in the UK are quite accessible. people can go get a reader card and go look at these things. Spanish records and the French records aren't as easily accessible. Even if you read Spanish or French, you've got to know like how it was written and dealt with back then. It's apparently a whole sub-discipline to really understand the language as it's written and all of that. So you need much more specialized knowledge, and the archives are more difficult to kind of gain access to. But those who have those skills, I don't, to do that kind of stuff.
We'll get you a translator.
Right. Well, we need special translators. So we have the accounts of English victims and English authorities. Remember, they were attacking Spanish and French vessels and operating sometimes outside of where the sensory apparatus of the English state existed, but the French state. And what are the French naval officers saying happened on that week? That there was a raid on Martinique that Blackbeard did and burned half the town. I've never seen the French account of that raid. There might be some really interesting things in there.
Your lines here again.
Oh yeah, I have the paper. I know what my questions would be, but it's So I think there's a lot to be discovered there. Probably especially Spanish records, because just a lot of the geography that they were operating in was in the Spanish realm, and I think that those are the records that have been least dug at by scholars. So.
Very cool.
Stay tuned on that.
And you're working on another book right now that's, I think, the fourth of that series about the colonialization of America.
Yeah,
right?
So the sort of regional cultures of our country. The original book was American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. It has a couple of follow-on books that develop things, but it's dealing with like what is the real backstory and problems of U.S. nationhood in our story? Who are we? Why are we vulnerable in the ways we are? Why are there red states and blue? Why is there a disagreement on some of the fundamental things that most other societies agree on, the big picture stuff about how, balance of church and state and, individual liberty and common good. There's a general reckoning that we don't have here. The new book is dealing with like very specifically data-driven, like how the existence of these regional cultures explains current hot button issues, from gun control through climate change and everything in between.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here